Hey, everyone! Ready for another one? Since you apparently enjoy seeing me in deplorable situations, let's do this. Get comfortable, dim the lights, take a deep breath as if that's going to help anything. Prepare yourselves for the newest incredible adventure story, which, let's be honest, will be another monumental screw-up, courtesy of your favorite grumpy nerd. You know that moment when you know you should have learned to say no? Not to others. I can actually do that with admirable efficiency. I mean saying no to yourself. To that stupid impulse that whispers in your ear, this will go well. Spoiler, it never does. There I was, once again, descending the stairs to my grandmother's basement. The same old scene, humidity you could chew, a smell that's a complex mixture of mothballs, wet earth, and past regrets, and lighting that depends on my goodwill to hold a flashlight that runs on 3 batteries and a prayer. The basement is a sanctuary of disorder, a museum of things no one had the heart to throw away. And in the center of it all, like an altar to bad decisions, the dusty coffee table. And on it, the book. Of course, it was there. Waiting for me. Tempus Deviationum. The pseudo-elegant Latin title only makes it all the more ironic. Time deviation. It almost sounds like a GPS feature. In practice, it's more like Russian roulette with your own existence. And as always, because self-sabotage is my favorite sport, because the curiosity in me is a chronic illness, because I'm me. I open the book. The parchment pages, dry and brittle, made that sound you hear in cheap adventure movies. And there it was, a new chapter, a new spell, a new opportunity to visit a historical period that, invariably, had no basic sanitation, human rights, or Wi-Fi. I read. Aloud, of course. Because apparently, my brain has an open-door policy for terrible ideas. In tempus pestilentia et umbri, ego devio, ad locum ubi murmur regnat. I don't even bother translating anymore. It's always the same poetic litany to throw me into some sewer of the past. The usual whirlwind began to pull the air from the room. That weird noise, which I still insist sounds like a goat laughing uncontrollably, echoed through the basement. My legs left the floor. The last thing I saw was the spiderweb on the ceiling, probably the only happy resident of that place. And thud. The landing. It's never smooth. It's always a dull thud, as if the universe just carelessly tosses me into a corner. This time, I was deposited on my back onto something cold, damp, and uneven. I opened my eyes. The night sky was a sickly, lead gray, polluted by a thick smoke that scratched my throat. The air, the air. It was an offense to my lungs. A cocktail of coal soot, omnipresent dampness, horse droppings, and something else, something sour, piercing, the unmistakable smell of misery and large-scale decay. I stood up, my back cracking in protest. I was in a narrow alley, squeezed between 2 dark, soot-stained brick buildings. The ground was a mix of mud and slippery cobblestones. A fine, icy drizzle began to fall, just to ensure the level of discomfort reached its maximum potential. "Oh, just great," I muttered to no one, adjusting my glasses on my face. London. Judging by the aromatic bouquet, I'd say the Victorian era. The height of the Industrial Revolution and the what the eye doesn't see, the sewer doesn't feel policy. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, lit only by a solitary gas lamp at the end of the alley, I noticed movement. Not people. Something lower, faster. Little shadows scurrying along the walls, disappearing into holes and cracks. Rats. Not one or two. Dozens. Hundreds, maybe. They moved with a shocking audacity, as if they were the true owners of the city. And, let's be honest, they probably were. They didn't seem intimidated by my presence. One of them, particularly robust and with the face of someone who had seen worse, stopped a few feet from me, staring with its beady little eyes, as if assessing whether my shoes were edible. "Don't even think about it, pal," I said, taking a step back. "These sneakers cost more than you and your entire lineage will earn in a lifetime of gnawing on crumbs." The rat, obviously not understanding modern economics, just twitched its nose and disappeared into a crevice. What a relief. The last thing I needed was to contract a medieval disease over a territorial dispute with a rodent. Although, on second thought, contracting a disease here would be almost redundant. The air itself felt like a petri dish. At least the braces on my teeth are more technologically advanced than the entire medical field of this era. Small victories. With a sigh of pure resignation, I decided that standing still in that stinking alley was an invitation to tetanus. I walked out onto the main street, and the scene opened up into a contained chaos. Horse-drawn carriages rumbled past, their iron wheels singing on the wet stones. Men in top hats and women in voluminous dresses and suffocating corsets hurried by, avoiding eye contact. Poverty and wealth coexisted side by side, one ignoring the other. Dickens's London in all its gray and depressing glory. It was then that I noticed a crowd. A small circle of people gathered on the corner, watching something with a mixture of disgust and fascination. Since I had absolutely nothing better to do, and the chance of finding a portal back home was zero until the book decided to show up, the siren of novelty in my brain blared louder than common sense, and my laziness guided me there. I pushed my way between a newspaper boy and a gentleman with a prominent mustache to see the center of the attraction. And there he was. The reason, I supposed, for my glorious trip. He wasn't a politician, nor a street performer. He was a middle-aged man, with a surprisingly proud posture. But what caught the eye was his uniform. And what a uniform it was. He wore a sort of bottle green tailcoat, a vibrant scarlet waistcoat, and a tall top hat that had seen better days. But the most spectacular detail was the thick leather sash he wore across his chest. From it, hanging like medals of honor, were small effigies of rats made of cast iron. The man wasn't giving a speech. He was working. Beside him, a small wooden cage held something moving frantically. With a theatrical gesture, he opened the little door and pulled out a ferret, lean and agile, with eyes like small onyx beads. He held it with the ease of someone holding a tool and approached a pile of wooden crates leaning against the tavern wall. "The show's about to start," a man with a toothless grin whispered beside me. The man in the extravagant uniform placed the ferret near a hole at the base of the crates. The small animal hesitated for a second, sniffed the air, and plunged into the darkness. The hunter then positioned himself beside the pile, holding a small net in one hand and, with the other, keeping two small, restless dogs on alert. They had wiry fur and their eyes were fixed on the wood. Terriers, my nerd brain informed me. A breed created for this. To kill. There was a tense silence. The crowd held its breath. Then, chaos. Rats began to pour out of every hole and crevice in the crates, fleeing the invisible predator that had invaded their nest. They were fast, desperate. But the terriers were faster. With a brutal and choreographed efficiency, the dogs leaped, snatched, and broke the rodents' necks with a single violent shake. It was a deadly dance, quick and terribly effective. The man, with his net, caught those that escaped the dogs. In less than a minute, it was all over. The ferret calmly emerged from the hole, and the hunter retrieved it. On the ground lay more than a dozen rats. The dogs, panting and proud, looked up at their master for approval. The crowd applauded. Yes, they applauded. As if they had just watched a Shakespearean play. The man took a theatrical bow, sweeping the floor with his top hat. "Behold, Jack Black," proclaimed the same toothless man beside me. Her Majesty Queen Victoria's official rat catcher. Of course. It had to be. Jack Black. My ever-helpful brain began to spit out information I had read in some forgotten book. He wasn't just an exterminator. He was a minor celebrity. A 19th century micro-influencer. His fame came not only from his efficiency but from his sense of showmanship. The uniform, the pose, it was all part of the show. I watched as he, with an unnerving calm, collected the bodies of the rats and placed them in a canvas bag. My historian side knew what would happen to some of them. The strongest, the most aggressive, wouldn't simply be discarded. They would be sold. Sold to the rat pits, illegal arenas where dogs were set to compete, killing the largest number of rats in the shortest amount of time. A brutal form of entertainment for a brutal era. Jack Black wasn't just a public servant, he was an entrepreneur. Monetizing pests and the public's thirst for violence. There I was, standing in the fine London drizzle, witnessing the intersection of public service, pest control, and bloody entertainment. And the most bizarre part of it all? The normality of the scene. People began to disperse, commenting on the dog's skill, the ferret's bravery, the catcher's pomp. To them, this was as common as buying bread. I, on the other hand, was stuck in a loop of fascination and repulsion. This was the world the book had sent me to. A world where your official title could be the Queen's rat catcher, and that entitled you to wear a ridiculous uniform and be applauded for a public slaughter. As the street returned to its normal rhythm and Jack Black and his dogs moved on, probably to the next nest, the next show, I was left alone with my thoughts. Or rather, my thoughts assaulted me. The slaughter. The performance. The mud. The pattern of the bricks on the building across the street. How many bricks could there be? Hundreds? Thousands? Has anyone ever stopped to count? Focus, Ned, focus. The reality is filthier and more dangerous than Jack Black's performance, and I was about to get to know it up close. With a sigh that seemed to carry the full weight of London's pollution, I shoved my hands into the pockets of my hoodie, the only piece of the 21st century I had left, and began to walk aimlessly through the dark streets. The show was over, but my forced stay in this giant rat hole was just beginning. Wandering aimlessly in a modern city is an exercise in boredom. You look at shop windows, dodge people staring at their phones, maybe stop for an overpriced coffee. Wandering aimlessly in Victorian London is an extreme survival sport. Every step is a negotiation with mud puddles of mysterious depth. Every dark corner looks like the setting of a true crime documentary. And the cold is something else. It's not the dry, honest cold of a winter you know. It's a damp, sticky cold that seeps into your cotton hoodie, clings to your bones, and whispers in your ear that you're going to die of pneumonia. My body, accustomed to the luxury of central heating and synthetic fabrics, was in a state of shock. My teeth, or rather, the metal of my braces, felt like they had turned into a tuning fork, vibrating with the temperature. I needed a place minimally protected from the drizzle and the biting wind, if only to postpone my imminent hypothermia. It was the smell that guided me. Not a good smell, of course. Nothing here smelled good. But it was a different smell. A mix of cheap ale, wet sawdust, and a vague human warmth. It came from a corner tavern called the Weary Traveler. The irony was not lost on me. A weathered wooden sign creaked and swung above the door. I had no money, and my appearance as a weird, red-headed kid in strange clothes probably wouldn't earn me a warm welcome. So, I opted for Plan B, leaning against the side wall of the building, in the service alley, where some of the heat from the kitchen chimney leaked out, creating a small zone of relative comfort. It was 5-star luxury compared to the rest of the city. The warmth was minimal, but the smell of mutton fat and boiled potatoes was almost comforting. It was there, in my oasis of mediocrity, that I found the second act of my pest control tour. Unlike Jack Black in his rock star performance, this was a show with no audience. A thin, hunched man, dressed in shabby wool clothes and a hat that was more stained than fabric, was negotiating with a burly fellow I assumed was the tavern owner. He didn't have a leather sash with iron rats. He had a dirty burlap sack on the ground, which moved slightly. Beside him, a single terrier, a female with ruffled fur and a scar over one eye, sat patiently, shivering a little from the cold or anxiety. "I counted 23, said the catcher, his voice hoarse and tired. 23? Let me see that, Alfie, the tavern owner replied, suspicious. Alfie, the catcher, opened the sack and dumped his day's catch onto the stone ground of the alley. The tavern owner crouched down, prodding the lifeless bodies with the tip of his boot. The terrier bitch, Pip, I heard the owner call her that, gave a small whine but remained still at her master's command. 23. The owner grumbled. But look at this one, it's a pup. And this other one? It's half-eaten. I can't pay full price for these. I watched the scene, fascinated by this microcapitalism of death. They were haggling over the value of rat carcasses. It was the Victorian Uber Eats of extermination, on-demand work, pay per piece, and the customer still complains to get a discount. A rat's life, or rather, a rat's death, was worth a few pence. But a small or damaged rat? It was worth less. The logic was impeccable and depressing. After a brief argument, they reached an agreement. The tavern owner handed a few coins to Alfie, who pocketed them without even counting. The day's work was paid for. The owner went back inside, and Alfie began to collect the rats, throwing them back into the sack. He must have felt my eyes on him because he suddenly turned. His eyes were tired but sharp. "Lost something, boy?" My mind went into emergency mode. Saying I was a time traveler would, at best, earn me a straitjacket. So, I used the truth, but in a way that would sound plausible for the era. "I'm just observing the efficiency of your animal," I said, pointing to the terrier. "It's impressive." That seemed to disarm him. A man's pride in his work tool is a universal language. A rare, tiny smile formed on his cracked lips. "Pip? Oh, she's the best. Her father was a champion in the pits. It's in her blood," he said, patting the dog's head, which responded with an almost imperceptible wag of her tail. "But it's not just the dog, you see. It's the whole system." And that's when the world around me vanished. The cold, the smell, the fear of being lost in time, it all disappeared. My brain switched into hyperfocus mode. I needed to understand every detail of that system. Like a reluctant teacher before an unexpectedly curious student, he crouched beside a small wooden box I hadn't noticed before. He opened it, and inside, nestled in straw, was his other work partner, a white ferret, fast asleep. "This is Jasper," Alfie said. "The real unsung hero. The dog does the dirty work in plain sight, but it's this little devil that goes into the darkness and drives them out." He picked up the ferret, which woke up and stretched in his hands. "People think you just let him loose in the hole. But no! If you let him go hungry, he'll hunt the first rat he finds, eat it, and sleep the whole night in there. You'll never see him again. You have to feed him well beforehand." He then showed me a crucial detail. There was a small piece of leather tied around the ferret's snout. "And you have to muzzle him," he continued, his voice now a professorial whisper. "Not tightly, just enough so he can't bite and kill. His job isn't to kill. It's to scare. To bite, to bother, to invade the nest and create panic. He's the agent of chaos." The rats flee from him in a panic, and they run straight into Pip's mouth. It's a partnership. One flushes, the other finishes. I was getting a complete lesson on 19th century rodent hunting tactics. It was more complex and, in a way, more ingenious than I had imagined. It wasn't brute force, it was psychology. Rat psychology. "Is the pay always per rat?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Alfie let out a short, bitter laugh. "Most of the time. Some places, like the flour mills, pay me a flat rate per week to keep the place clean. But for most, yes. Coins for carcasses. On good days, like today, you can eat and pay for a room in a lodging house. On bad days, well, on bad days you hope it doesn't rain so much." He looked at my clothes, at my rubber-soled sneakers, with a curiosity that didn't delve deep. I was just another oddity in a city full of them. To him, I was probably a rich kid who had run away from home, playing at being poor for a day. Little did he know. Pip, the terrier, came closer and sniffed my jeans. She looked as tired as her owner. A veteran of a never-ending war. I reflected on how we humans are masters at outsourcing our dirty work. We breed and train other species to do the things we don't want to, or can't, do. Dogs to hunt, horses to transport, ferrets to enter infested burrows. And we pay them with a pat on the head and leftover food, if they're lucky. Alfie put Jasper back in his box and slung the sack of dead rats over his shoulder. The weight made his body hunch even more. He was about to leave when a cough shook him. It wasn't a normal cough. It was a deep, cavernous cough that seemed to come from the bottom of his lungs, bringing with it a damp, concerning echo. He leaned against the wall for a moment, catching his breath. "Are you okay?" I asked, more out of instinct than real concern. Empathy is a luxury when you're trying not to freeze to death yourself. He waved his hand, dismissing my question. "It's just the London air. Gets inside you," he said, breathless. "But you have to be careful in this trade. Very careful. It's not the bites that get you. Every catcher gets bitten sooner or later. It's something else. A fever." He looked at me, his tired eyes suddenly focused and serious, as if he were giving me the only valuable advice he possessed. "It starts slow. Body aches, chills. You think it's just a cold from the damp. But then the fever rises. And it doesn't come down. That's how it was with Bill, who worked at the dock warehouses. A strong man. The fever took him in less than a week. The word fever hung in the cold air between us, heavy with a weight I was beginning to understand. It wasn't just the visible danger of teeth and claws. There was an invisible, silent enemy, hiding not in the rats themselves, but in their tracks. Alfie adjusted the sack on his shoulder and, with a final nod, disappeared into the darkness of the alley, his bitch trotting silently beside him. I was alone again, the warmth from the chimney suddenly feeling insufficient. The work was brutal, the pay was miserable. And now, I knew the risk was deadly. The image of Jack Black, the showman, seemed like a distant memory, a farce. The reality was Alfie, his tired body, his deep cough, and his grim warning about the fever. I had just learned that for a rat catcher, the greatest danger wasn't the creature he hunted, but the disease it left behind. And I, with my 21st century immune system, was probably as vulnerable as a newborn. What a comforting thought for a cold night. I stood there for a time I can't measure. The cold, which had been my biggest problem, seemed to retreat, replaced by a different kind of shiver. An internal shiver. The rat catcher Alfie's cough echoed in my mind, along with his warning, "It's not the bites, it's the fever." Fever. Such a common, banal word. I've had a fever dozens of times. You take an antipyretic, your mom tells you to stay in bed, you skip school, watch some crap on TV, and the next day you're good as new. But the way he said it, the way his tired eyes gained a glint of dread, that was no ordinary fever. And then, as always, my nerd brain, that internal hard drive overloaded with useless information and obscure facts, started running the program. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Victorian London. Poor sanitation. A rat population that would make a modern metropolis envious. Men working in sewers, damp basements, filthy docks. And a mysterious, fatal fever. It wasn't a mystery to me. I knew its name. Weil's disease. Or, to use the more scientific term that bubbled up in my memory from some documentary I watched on a sleepless night, leptospirosis. And the worst part was remembering how it spread. Alfie's warning about the bites not being the main danger was absolutely correct. The danger wasn't in the rat's teeth. It was in its urine. The leptospirobacteria, tiny and invisible, thrived in stagnant water and damp soil contaminated by rodent urine. And it didn't need a large wound to get inside you. A small scratch on your hand. A broken cuticle. A splash of dirty water in your eyes or mouth. And that was it. The unwanted passenger was on board. Suddenly, the entire city transformed before my eyes. Every mud puddle was no longer just mud, it was a potential petri dish. Every damp alley wall wasn't just damp, it was a contaminated surface. I, who until then had been annoyed but relatively fearless, now felt like I was walking barefoot through an invisible minefield. I looked at my own hands, pale from the cold, and at my canvas sneakers, now completely soaked. I was a walking gateway for one of the worst infections of the pre-antibiotic era. "Oh, wonderful," I whispered to the night. So, basically, I'm taking a relaxing stroll inside a city-sized portable toilet during a rainstorm. The sarcasm came out weak, a failing defense mechanism. Knowledge was a curse. I remembered the stages of the disease. First, it seemed like a bad flu, high fever, excruciating headache, muscle aches that made it feel like your bones were breaking. A rat catcher, used to living in discomfort, could easily ignore it, thinking it was just another bad day. But then came the second phase. That's when the real terror began. Jaundice, which turned the patient's skin and eyes a ghostly yellow. Internal bleeding. The kidneys and liver, overwhelmed by the infection, would simply shut down. Organ failure. It was a brutally efficient way to deconstruct a human being from the inside out. And the mortality rate, in this era without dialysis or antibiotics, was sky high. Alfie's cough. Could that have been the beginning? Driven by a morbid curiosity and the need not to stand still thinking about my own body being invaded by corkscrew-shaped bacteria, I started walking again. But my path had changed. I was no longer just wandering, I was searching. Searching for signs. My destination seemed to be the poorer areas, the tenements and alleys where men like Alfie probably lived. It didn't take long. I entered an even narrower street, lined with tall, decrepit apartment buildings where entire families squeezed into a single room. The poverty here was palpable, a layer of soot and despair that covered everything. And the silence was different. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but a silence of sickness. I saw a half-open door on the ground floor of one of these buildings. A woman was sitting on the front steps, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Beside her, on the ground, a metal basin with some bloody water. A stern-looking man, carrying a black leather case, came out of the building, shook his head negatively at the woman, and left without a word. A doctor, or the closest thing one could afford in this place. My curiosity overcame my prudence. The door was still ajar. I peeked inside. The room was tiny, almost bare. There was an iron cot against the back wall, and lying on it was a man. He was trembling violently under a thin, dirty blanket, despite the stuffy air in the room. Even in the dim light, I could see it. The skin on his face and neck had an unmistakable, almost luminous, yellowish hue. His eyes, half open, were the same color. He was muttering incoherently, delirious. I couldn't see his face clearly, but it didn't matter if it was Alfie or Bill from the docks or anyone else. He was the personification of the warning. The final statistic of that trade. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The smell coming from inside, a sweet, sickly odor, clung to my nostrils. It was the smell of death. The reality of Weil's disease was no longer a historical fact read in a book. It was there, just a few feet away from me, in all its jaundiced agony. Fear, real fear, hit me like a wave of ice-cold water. This wasn't an adventure. It was a nightmare. Every little drop of rain on my skin felt like it was burning. I remembered a small scratch I got on my hand earlier, squeezing past the fence. Suddenly, it was throbbing, whether imaginary or not. My mind, which minutes before had been proud of its knowledge, was now using it to torture me, projecting the disease's cycle onto my own body. I had to get out of there. I needed a dry place. A safe place. I turned and walked, then trotted, then ran. I ran without direction, away from that building, that street, that smell. I ran until my 21st century lungs, unaccustomed to that heavy air, began to burn. I stopped in a wider alley, behind what looked like a warehouse. There was a pile of old crates and a small wooden lean-to against the wall, probably for storing empty barrels. Without a second thought, I dove in, curling up in the darkest and, miraculously, driest corner. I hugged my knees, trying to stop shaking. It wasn't just the cold. It was the shock. The shock of seeing history too up close. Today's lesson wasn't about tools or celebrities. It was about vulnerability. About how life, for so many people, in so many eras, was fragile, suspended by the thinnest of threads over an abyss of invisible dangers. There, huddled in the dark, listening to the rain drumming on the wooden roof, I felt small. A grumpy nerd, a lazy anti-hero, thrown into a world where a simple splash of water could mean the end. The city outside was no longer a historical setting, it was a predator. And I was the most clueless prey of all. I don't know how long I stayed huddled in that lean-to. Time here seems to move differently, denser, like molasses. Every minute dragged on, filled with the sound of my own breathing and the drumming of the rain, which thankfully began to subside. My initial panic had crystallized into a constant, corrosive, low-grade anxiety. I had become an expert in paranoia. Every creak of the wood was an approaching rat. Every drop that dripped from a crack in the roof was a biological projectile loaded with leptospires. I was on high alert, a soldier in enemy territory, except my uniform was a hoodie and my only weapon was useless knowledge about what could kill me. With the first sign of a gray, watery light seeping through the cracks in the wood, the night began to yield. Dawn in London wasn't a glorious event with shades of orange and pink. It was more like someone slowly turning up the brightness on a dirty light bulb. The city didn't wake up, it reanimated, like an exhausted body forced to rise for another day of toil. From my hiding spot, I had a privileged view, if you can even use that word, of an inner courtyard, surrounded on three sides by tenement buildings. There was a single manual water pump in the center, from which a gutter fed a series of stone troughs. And with the first light came the first people. The women. Dressed in layers of worn-out clothes, they emerged from the dark doorways, carrying baskets and buckets of dirty laundry. They formed a silent queue at the water pump, each waiting their turn to fill their buckets with the cold, and undoubtedly impure, water. Then the work began. With their hands submerged in the icy water, they scrubbed the clothes on washboards, using a coarse soap that looked more like a block of clay. I watched them, mesmerized. Their hands were red and chapped from the cold and the lye in the soap. And they were constantly wet. Every little cut, every fissure in their skin, was an open invitation to the disease I had witnessed the night before. They didn't hunt rats in dark alleys for money, but they fought the same war, in an even more intimate way. A war against filth, against contagion, against the army of invisible germs that the rats left behind on every fiber of fabric, in every drop of water. Their job was to protect their families, to maintain a semblance of cleanliness and health in a world that was fundamentally dirty and sick. And there was no audience to applaud them. No extravagant uniforms or official titles. Their work was essential, endless, and completely invisible to the rest of the world. As the morning progressed, the children began to appear. Some were small, barely able to walk, and they came out into the courtyard, barefoot in the cold mud, playing with sticks and stones. To them, that contaminated courtyard was their playground. They jumped in puddles with a joy that was both moving and terrifying. I, the 21st century genius, saw each puddle as a hotbed of leptospirosis. They just saw an opportunity to splash water. Ignorance, sometimes, is a blessing that history insists on stealing from us. I saw a boy, who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, come out of one of the doors. He wasn't dressed to play. He wore a thin, patched coat and carried a small shoeshine box. He exchanged a quick nod with his mother, who stopped scrubbing for a moment to watch him go, and disappeared into the street. He was already a worker. A veteran of an economic war he was too young to understand. And I remembered complaining when my mom asked me to clean my room or take out the trash. Here, children weren't taught to recycle, they were, in many cases, the system's recyclable material. I moved away from the crack in the wood, retreating into the darkness of my shelter. What I was seeing wasn't just a collection of individual tragedies. It was an ecosystem. A perfectly designed system of poverty and disease. The rat wasn't the main villain of the story, it was a symptom. The real disease was indifference. The indifference that allowed people to live piled on top of each other in unventilated buildings, drink water from contaminated pumps, and send their children to work before they could even read. The rat catcher, with his performance and his dogs, wasn't curing the disease. He was just treating one of its most visible symptoms, pruning the branches of a rotten tree whose roots were too deep to reach. My problems, my complaints, my modern teenage existential dread, it all seemed so absurdly small, so shamefully trivial. My suffering was not having Wi-Fi. Their suffering was trying not to die of hemorrhagic fever before they turned 30. Hunger began to gnaw at my stomach for real. The cold had become a constant ache. The paranoia was still there, but now mixed with a new emotion, a grim determination. I couldn't stay here forever. My dry hiding spot was an anomaly, a temporary bubble of safety. Staying put was a slow death sentence by starvation or exposure. Going out was risking an encounter with a fatal bacterium. Great options, I muttered to myself. It's like choosing between being boiled or fried. In the end, the result is the same. But I had one advantage that none of those people in the courtyard had. I had a way out. Somewhere in this filthy neighborhood, my book, The Temps Deviationum, was waiting for me. It always showed up. That was the sick rule of this game. To go back, I had to find it. And to find it, I had to move. I took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling my lungs. The fear hadn't gone away, but I couldn't let it paralyze me anymore. I had seen the spectacle, the tools, the disease, and the system. The history lesson was complete. Now it was time for the final exam, survival. I pulled my hood over my head, a useless psychological protection, and prepared to leave the relative safety of my shelter. The plan was simple and stupid: walk around, avoiding touching anything, breathing through my mouth as little as possible, and keeping my eyes peeled for an anachronistic, out-of-place object. A time-traveling spell book. In Victorian London. Piece of cake. Leaving my wooden shelter was like diving back into ice-cold water after finding a tiny air pocket. The world outside was noisy, chaotic, and, to my newly trained mind, lethal. Every person who passed me was a potential vector of disease. Every puddle I jumped over was an abyss of bacteria. I moved in a way I had never moved before, with purpose. "Okay, Ned," I whispered to myself, keeping my head down and my hood up. Survival mode activated. Think like a ninja with obsessive-compulsive disorder and an acute phobia of moisture. My brain, now operating with the clarity of desperation, began to devise a strategy. The book. Where would it be? It wouldn't appear in a shop window or a library. The book had a sick sense of humor. It integrated itself into the environment. And what was the essence of this environment? Filth. Discarded things. Lost and forgotten objects. There was a place where all of this converged, the great drain of the city. The River Thames. I started moving in the direction I believed the river to be. The air grew thicker, saltier, and the smell of rotten fish and open sewage became the dominant note in London's olfactory symphony. The streets became busier, with dockworkers, sailors, and loaded carts. I was invisible, just another dirty, anonymous kid slinking through the crowd. Finally, I reached the bank. And it was worse than I had imagined. The tide was low, revealing a vast expanse of black, sticky mud that glistened under the gray sky. And in the mud, there were children. The mudlarks. Boys and girls, some not even 10 years old, sunk up to their knees in that toxic sludge, sifting with their bare hands for anything of value, pieces of copper, coal, old rope. Anything that could be traded for a few coins. I stood still, watching them. They were the final image of my history lesson. The bottom of the pyramid. Desperation in its purest, most hard-working form. And the cruel irony was that they were, literally, waiting in the epicenter of the disease that terrorized the rat catchers, day after day. A wave of hopelessness hit me. How could I find a book here? In this cemetery of debris, this museum of misery? Looking for a magic book here was like looking for a specific needle in a haystack the size of a city block. A very damp, stinking, and probably infectious haystack. I sat down on a mooring post, feeling the energy drain from my body. The cold, the hunger, and the fear were finally taking their toll. Maybe this was it. Maybe the book wouldn't show up this time. Maybe I was stuck here forever, destined to become another anonymous ghost in this gray city. I closed my eyes, exhausted. That's when I stumbled. I was sitting, but my mind stumbled. The logic of the book. It wouldn't let me die here. Its sick purpose was to teach me a lesson and then spit me back out. The lesson was learned. The final exam had been administered. The exit had to be here. I opened my eyes again, but this time, I wasn't looking for hope. I was looking for something that didn't belong. Something anachronistic. My gaze swept the tide line. Trash. Pieces of wood. Oyster shells. Old rags. And there, right on the edge of a pile of refuse, partially covered by a torn fishing net. It was a rectangle. A dark leather rectangle, with a binding on the spine that was far more refined than anything else around. The color was faded by the moisture, the cover stained with mud, but there was no doubt. It was him. Temps deviationum. The exhaustion evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. I slid off my perch and ran to the trash pile, not caring about the mud splattering on my pants. With trembling hands, I pulled the book from the filth. It was heavy, real. It was cold and damp, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life. I didn't waste any time. There was no need for a dramatic moment. I just needed to leave. I opened the cover with a familiar creak and flipped through the pages with desperate fingers. Where is it? Where is it? And there, at the end, the counterpart to every travel spell. The return. The Latin words seemed to glow on the page. I didn't recite them. I choked them out, my voice a hoarse, urgent whisper, looking over my shoulder as if the city itself might try to stop me. Ad mea tempora, ad meum locum, domum redire. Nunc. The world dissolved. The smell of the Thames was the last thing I registered before being pulled into the familiar vortex. The sound of the laughing goat almost sounded like music. The sensation of free falling through time and space. And thud. Silence. An almost absolute silence. The air was still, dry, and smelled of dust and old paper. I opened my eyes. I was lying face down on the cold concrete floor of my grandmother's basement. Above me, the single, weak, yellowish incandescent bulb hung from its wire. It was the sun. It was the moon. It was the most glorious sight in the universe. I lay there for a long time, just breathing. Inhaling air that didn't carry coal soot and exhaling without fear of releasing my soul along with it. I raised a hand and looked at it. It was dirty with London soot and mud, but it was free of jaundice. I turned it over. The scratch was still there, small and insignificant. I laughed, a strange, relieved sound. Finally, with my muscles aching in a way that felt almost pleasant, I stood up. The book was on the floor beside me. I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, and placed it back on the coffee table, in the exact spot where I found it. "Okay," I said to the book. "I get it." Message received. Don't complain about modern life. Basic sanitation is good. Antibiotics are great. Understood. I turned and started up the stairs, my feet making a soft sound on the wooden steps. Each step up was a step away from that world. The normal daylight, filtering through the basement door, seemed incredibly bright. I stopped at the top of the stairs and looked back into the darkness of the basement. Mental note, I muttered to the silence. Next time I think my day is bad because the internet is down, I'll try to remember what it's like to have to choose between starving to death or dying of hemorrhagic fever. Now, go to sleep. Enjoy your clean sheets and the absence of 19th century diseases in the air you breathe. A luxury, believe me. And since you've made it this far, do me a favor and click the buttons down below. Subscribe, hit the bell, all that stuff you do. After all, I need witnesses, and maybe accomplices, for the next time my curiosity decides to commit an attack against my own safety. Someone has to be there to hear about the next disaster. Good night, and sweet dreams without rats.